Welcome to Normal Ireland Live. I'm Curtis Daly. Now, this isn't live, but rather we have a special NHS show for you, and we'll be joined by the superb Dr. Julia Patterson later on. Now, you can help us grow by visiting turnleftmedia.co.uk/support to help fund our work, or by becoming a YouTube member. In June 2010, a Commonwealth report looking at 7 of the most advanced economies' healthcare systems determines that the UK had the most efficient healthcare system in the world. In relation to access, the study says the UK has relatively short waiting times for basic medical care and non-emergency access to services after hours, but has longer waiting times for specialist care and elective non-emergency surgery. The Netherlands ranked very highly on all waiting times measurements. When it came to efficiency, the UK and Australia ranked first and second, respectively. Efficiency was measured by looking at total national spending on health as a percentage of gross domestic product (GDP), as well as the amount of spending on health administration and insurance. How strange does that sound in 2025? Short waiting times, easy access to quality care. And what happened in the 15 years since then? Well, in 2012, Jeremy Hunt became Health Secretary and swore, the way that Conservatives often do, to protect the NHS. We're supposed to believe that Conservatives in this country have respect for the NHS, but not any other kind of public service. The NHS is the one exception to that rule, they claim. Jeremy Hunt also co-authored a book on how to turn public services into private enterprise so that rich people could make profit from them. In particular, the book called for the NHS to be replaced with a private insurance model. In the time Hunt was Health Secretary, NHS funding stagnated as a percentage of GDP, as shown on this graph by Novara Media. And you might say, so what? NHS funding remained at 7% of GDP. What difference does that make? Well, bear in mind the population of the UK grew by 4.3 million in that time. That is going to require more funding, but NHS funding stagnated. The Tories put more funding in than ever before, but the increase was too little. In fact, those who want to privatise the NHS love saying that it receives loads of funding and more funding than ever before. Take this example of Christian Niemiec of the IEA talking to Mike Graham about NHS funding.
For a long time, we've had this social taboo. You were not supposed to criticize the NHS, but now it's not really surprising. So we pay more than ever. The spending is at record levels, the highest it's ever been. Yeah. But we're not getting much in return. We have still more than 6 million people on a waiting list of some sort. And some of these people are, in fact, on multiple waiting lists, waiting for multiple treatments at the same time. It's the equivalent of paying for a business class flight with, say, Qatar Airways and then getting a Ryanair flight if the plane arrives at all.
Yeah, actually, I mean, if the NHS was run like Ryanair, it'd be a lot better, to be honest, because, I mean, at least Ryanair is run as a proper business and it's run on very strict economic lines. And if you can't do something because it's too expensive, you just don't do it.
Sorry, it's just too expensive to save your grand, so we won't do it. These people aren't hiding the facts that they want a privatised NHS anymore. Mike literally said he wants it run like a business. Businesses run for profit, to make money for a rich person who owns the resources. The NHS is run to give people healthcare. Now, Christian Niemiec will say that the NHS has given more funding than ever before, and that's kind of deceptive. It's like saying that the minimum wage is twice as much as it was in 2005 compared to today. And that's probably true, but it doesn't account for the increased cost of living. In real terms, our wages, like NHS funding, have stagnated. The IEA won't tell us who funds them and are rated among the worst think tanks for donor transparency. We don't know whether big private healthcare corporations fund them, but we can take an educated guess. Another way of looking at NHS funding is to look at how much we spend per capita on healthcare with comparable countries. According to the Health Foundation, the UK spends around €1,000 less per person on healthcare than France, Germany, and other similar G7 economies. If we're spending €1,000 less per person, how can the IEA claim that the NHS is not being funded? Julia, what are your thoughts on the systematic underfunding of the NHS?
This is such a big question. It's also probably going to become really topical because the autumn budget is around the corner. And I think we're going to be coming back to this question of, does the NHS have enough money or not? Now, just to be clear, when I'm speaking about the NHS in this context, I'm talking about the NHS in England. The NHS is actually 4 different organisations across the UK, and each of those different nations organises things differently. But when we're talking about the NHS budget in England, for a very long time now, there's been a conversation about it being chronically underfunded and the impact that's had on the service and patients and staff, right? It's still not got enough money, which is contentious, and it causes people to get very angry online when we're talking about the NHS. Basically, what happened was the NHS started in 1948. Just like all healthcare systems across the world, healthcare gets more expensive every year. That's partly for a good reason. It's because we have higher health expectancies. People live longer. We have an aging population, right? I personally think that those things should be seen as progress, but we obviously have to evolve our healthcare system in order to meet those needs. And so what it means is that the healthcare system here and everywhere else becomes more expensive every year. And politicians need to devote more and more money to the healthcare system in order to meet the needs of the public. Over the course of sort of decades, we have had a sort of average increase in real term spending of somewhere around 3.8% year on year. It has varied decade to decade. And then during the Tories' leadership, that dipped significantly, and there were huge cutbacks. We lost staff, we lost hospital beds, we lost services. Everybody felt all of that. They referred to it as austerity cuts. It was really, really terrible for the NHS. And then we went into the pandemic, which also exacerbated all the problems that were already going on. And that's essentially why the NHS is in the state it's currently in. Now, a lot of people hoped that Labour were going to turn this situation around when they came to power. They spoke a lot about how the NHS was at the top of their priorities, bringing down the waiting lists, etc., etc. And then last autumn, when Rachel Reeves made her first budget, there was a lot of noise about the amount of money that the NHS was given compared to other governmental departments. And it is true that the NHS was awarded more money than other areas that really, really lost out. But in order to rebuild the NHS, which is what Labour said they were going to do, they would have had to go even further with their funding. It was acknowledged by lots of experts at the time that a lot of the money that was given to the NHS last autumn was going to get absorbed by long overdue pay rises and by other costs that the organisation unfortunately has now because the population is growing and ageing. So that money that was given to the NHS last autumn was never going to be enough to fix things. And so since then, a lot of people have been asking how Labour are really going to achieve their own goals politically because they want to bring down the NHS waiting list. They're saying a lot of big things about an NHS 10-year plan, and people aren't really sure how that plan is going to get realised because they're still not putting the right amount of funding into the service. So it's a huge conversation at the moment for anyone who's talking about the NHS, and it needs to get fixed because until it does, we're not going to see things in the NHS improve significantly.
We hear a lot of conversation every election. People will say, vote because the NHS is going to be destroyed. We hear that a lot. We hear that rhetoric a lot. And we also hear it needs more money. I agree, right? But the opposition to the NHS will say, we put in so much money already. And when is it going to be back to what it was before? And then some people sort of ask the question. They say, you know what, maybe the NHS isn't fit for purpose in the 21st century. So what do you say to those people who try and say, actually, the healthcare system we have isn't working for an aging population because we put money into it and we don't get the results we want? What's your perspective and how would you answer that question?
Yeah, it's interesting as well because a lot of the stuff that comes out of the right-wing media about the NHS makes out that people on the left are just wedded to this idea of the NHS as some kind of religious institution that we're all obsessed about or we're all bowing down to in this really unhealthy way. I actually haven't met with that attitude, I don't think, from anyone really, and I've been campaigning for the NHS for a decade. I was working as a doctor for a decade. It's more that a lot of people feel very strongly in having a safety net and having a public service that that works for everybody. And the NHS clearly isn't meeting that need at the moment, right? The NHS campaigners that I meet are very clear-eyed about this, actually. So 2 things. Firstly, the amount of money that goes into the NHS, I think there needs to be a much more honest and transparent conversation about where that money actually goes to, because at the moment, quite a lot of that money is then filtered out and funneled out into private companies, because over the last 40 years or so, politicians have changed the health service significantly. So lots of things are privatised and lots of money goes into private companies to deliver things for the NHS, and then some of that money is siphoned off as profit. I think if we could examine, exactly how much money is disappearing in that way, I think the public might be quite shocked. And on top of the sort of profit that's created by some private companies who deliver things for the NHS is also in debt to private companies in various places because of previous terrible policies that came from politicians involving private finance initiatives to build NHS hospitals and things like that. So when we think about giving the NHS more and more and more money, it's not that all of that money is going into delivering patient services. And I actually think we need to talk more clearly about that. The other thing that I feel very strongly, and I'm sure I'm not on my own, is that if politicians, and some of them are saying this, saying, the NHS isn't fit for purpose anymore and we need to have a rethink about things, then politicians need to bring that rethink to the public. Now, I used to think that a referendum would be a good idea where people were asked about their thoughts about the future of the NHS. I'm not sure that's such a good idea now, actually, given what happened with Brexit. But I certainly think that there needs to be a conversation happening in the public domain about how much the NHS costs, what the future of it is, what is the likely future of the growth of our population, our ageing population. But the reason for that is because everything in politics is about choices, right? From the work that I do, I know that the public really values the NHS above a lot of other things that politicians spend money on. If the public had more of a voice in what politicians spent the country's money on, I honestly think they would still put the NHS close to the top of that list. And if they were allowed to do that, if they could tell the politicians clearly what they wanted to do and politicians stuck to it, I think we would end up with an NHS that works really well for everyone, and probably other areas, unfortunately, would lose out. But at the moment, it feels like it's a conversation that goes on behind closed doors, and we have a lot of manifesto promises made by politicians that then don't follow through. And who loses out? Well, unfortunately, it's the patients. And I think that's really unforgivable. There should be a lot more honesty, I think, in politics, really.
I think it's kind of shameful that privatisation isn't brought up in the conversation. In the national conversation about the NHS, it is always about, are we putting in enough money? Do we need to make savings? The right wing will kind of push, people like the IEA, these kind of guys will talk about how, actually, we need a private health insurance model, which to a lot of people, they might not realise, in fact, the NHS relatively is quite cheap. Compare us to America, they spend more on healthcare per capita, and they don't even guarantee healthcare, right? So that's an entirely different conversation, but they want to push that. What I do think is really important, and I'm so glad you brought up privatisation, is yes, there's one issue about funding. I think the average is just under 4% increase each year. But we spend so much money that doesn't go to the frontline services. And actually, we could probably gut the bloating of the state when it comes to privatisation. So I want to ask you, and I think, you brought up Labour. I want to bring Labour into this conversation, all right? 15 years of austerity from the Conservatives. What did that look like from a doctor's perspective on the ground? And I know it's only been 1 year into a Labour government, but they said they made so much, progress and improvement. Can you tell me the perspective of the first year of a Labour government in terms of the NHS?
Yeah, so I don't work as a doctor in the NHS anymore. I campaign and I write. So I'm outside of the system from that perspective, but I'm paying very close attention to what is going on with the service. And it's actually really disappointing. What happened was they took over, obviously, in July in 2024. And I don't think anyone expected Labour to come up with a plan immediately. Although, given that the NHS was so far up their priority list, I would have expected some pretty clear goals to come out quickly from the Labour government. What actually happened is that they engaged in a very complicated and probably costly public consultation about the NHS, which went on for a full 12 months before they published their 10-year plan, which came out in July this year. And during that time, there was a lot of media engagement from Wes Streeting and others talking about bringing down NHS waiting lists, which hasn't been particularly successful. The last figures that I saw showed that in a 12-month period, they'd brought down the overall list by about 200,000 sort of treatments, which, given that we have a waiting list of over 7 million sort of treatments that are sort of waiting to happen, 200,000 is an absolute drop in the ocean. And the way that it's being described, the way they've achieved that is in part because of their engagement with private companies. Because back in January, Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer entered into a deal with private companies in order to deliver more NHS treatments. And so, in actual fact, the NHS itself, it's not going great. I don't think their plan is going fantastically. The 10-year plan, which was published in July, is a very, very long plan with lots of really big ideas. And when it came out, a lot of people asked questions about how exactly these plans were going to be realised, given that there isn't enough funding available to make them happen. And one of the biggest concerns currently for NHS campaigners is that we think they're about to announce more NHS privatisation in the autumn budget or sometime soon after, involving new private finance initiative deals for NHS hospitals or something similar. Is it helpful if I explain what those are, Curtis, just in case any of your...
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So several decades ago, we needed to have new NHS hospitals and among other things, lots of other public infrastructure too. And the politicians didn't want to put the upfront investment into building those things. And so they partnered with private companies in order to do it. And it was sold to the public as a good idea because the public were told this is going to be great. We'll pay the private companies off on a very long period of time. It will be good for the taxpayer. It's turned out to be terrible for public finances because it's landed us in an enormous amount of debt that we still haven't paid off. The debt is held, certainly with the NHS hospitals in England, by the trusts, the NHS trusts, and research that was done by Every Doctor recently, Every Doctor is the organisation that I run, showed that 69 NHS trusts are still in debt of, they're going to have to pay over £20 billion to private companies over the next 2 decades for these PFI deals that were signed several decades ago in order to pay off these buildings and maintenance contracts and so on. So it's really bad. It's bad because it's not good to be in debt. It's bad because it creates patchy financial instability as well, because some NHS trusts have been affected by this and some haven't. And in 2018, politicians finally decided that these weren't a good idea anymore, and they brought the PFI deals of that nature to a close, which meant that they couldn't enter into similar schemes. And it seemed like there was pretty unanimous agreement at the time that these schemes weren't a good idea and that we shouldn't revisit them. And yet what's happened is, within the 10-year plan that Keir Starmer has put out for the NHS, he has talked a lot about 200 neighbourhood health centres, and it's not clear within the plan specifically who's going to fund them. And from various bits of information that have come out around that time and since, it looks like Labour are going to private companies to figure out if they can enter into very similar private partnerships to the ones we had several decades ago, which is just not a good idea. It's not what we need right now, I don't think. And actually, something that gets me really cross, Curtis, is that I think if the public had been told prior to the election or after the election, or even when this 10-year plan came out, hi guys, this, we're going to have these 200 neighbourhood health centres, but there's a high likelihood it's going to involve private partnerships, I think there would have been a public outcry about it. But politicians are very good at drip feeding information gradually, so that by the time privatisation or, lots of other bad policies come about, it almost feels like an inevitability, and that we've lost the period of time where people could have a conversation and push back against a bad policy.
Yeah, I mean, Wes Streeting did say, I'm going to open up the floodgates to privatisation. But of course, the Labour Party in opposition weren't shouting from the rooftops, we're going to increase privatisation. I do want to ask, I think it's very, very clear when we look at political donations, especially Wes Streeting, which, we're going to talk about him later on. He has received money from private health insurance companies, right? We can see how that, influences politicians' policies. But I feel like there is this, Blairite attitude within the Labour Party that's, ideologically wedded to privatisation. We've heard Blairite figures say, look, I don't care if it's public or private. All I care about is patient satisfaction. We're not ideological. But it feels like that actually they really want to push privatisation. We know it doesn't work. We know it's more expensive. when you pointed out PFI, we know that, down the road, we have to pay it back. It becomes more expensive. So what else, apart from just political donations, in your view, why do you think, whether it's Blairites or Conservatives, why are they so wedded to NHS privatisation?
It's a complicated question. So first of all, I want to rewind slightly because I think it's worth us talking about this. I think a lot of people felt very cross at the time, and it slightly got lost to the all of the other noise that's gone on over the last few years. But when Keir Starmer was campaigning to become Labour leader, he campaigned on a platform of saying he was going to remove private outsourcing from the NHS. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what that is, NHS services in England are not all run by the NHS itself. Thousands of them are run by external organisations, including some major private companies. And a lot of people are concerned about this for several reasons. They don't like the idea of profit creation within the NHS. I think that's that's a pretty common complaint. It can also create fragmentation of the service itself, because if you think about it, as the NHS as a whole, with lots of services that talk to one another and work well with one another, if you start fragmenting it and having private companies running tiny parts of it and then having contract changeover, because that often happens because the contracts are often quite short, just a couple of years in length, then it means that for a patient, there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of churn. It creates admin, it creates bureaucracy, it costs money, it can break down staff-patient relationships. All of that is quite aside from the profit creation that goes on. And understandably, from the private company's perspective, if they enter into these contracts and then they don't prove to be as attractive as they had imagined, they will then obviously extricate themselves at a suitable time point, which means that the NHS ultimately holds the burden for things and that private companies can dip in and out as it suits them. So a lot of people who I know voted for Keir Starmer to become Labour leader specifically because, amongst other things, he said he was going to remove private sector outsourcing in the NHS, and they felt very, very positive about that. And then he rode back on that promise at a sort of quiet time in the media cycle. I think it was the summer of 2022. And he quietly just said something along the lines of, oh, unfortunately, there are some private companies involved in the NHS and we'll have to continue with that. Like, it was quite a neutral statement. He wasn't sounding super keen about privatisation at that point. But you're right, since then, he and Wes Streeting, before the election, did then start speaking very positively about the involvement of private companies in the NHS. Although even then, and I was watching this very, very closely along with a lot of other people, I'm sure, they were quite careful with the way that they described things, and it very much felt like they were going to be using private companies as a temporary measure to bring down waiting lists instead of embedding private companies in the very essence of what the NHS is, and tying us into very long contracts. I think they were quite careful not to put out that sort of messaging, because I think it would have been very off-putting for people. In terms of why Labour seem positive of privatisation in this way, it's quite interesting, Curtis. Like, I've been giving this an awful lot of thought over a very long period of time now, and I've been told exactly what you said about Labour politicians saying patients don't care who delivers my care, they just want to get the care, they don't have an opinion. First of all, I don't know that that's true.
I think we can agree that most people really don't like privatisation, so that's a very out of touch statement.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The majority of people consistently don't like privatisation. They don't, they've seen what it happens in other public sector services as well, right? It's not just the NHS. They don't like it. So first of all, I don't think that's true. But also, politicians are very, very careful about how the definition they use for privatisation. So if you look at the definition of privatisation within healthcare services, campaigners use the definition that came out from the World Health Organization in 1995, and we stick to it. And it's basically, it's not just ownership of stuff, it's who runs things. So private outsourcing, for example, if somebody comes in and they're running an NHS service and they have the NHS logo on their wall, but they're able to create a profit from running a service, that is also privatisation, right? And what we find is that some politicians make out that privatisation is simply a patient handing over money for something. So they will say things like, I don't believe in NHS privatisation because NHS services will always be free.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you can have loads of privatisation in the NHS, but things could still be free. And essentially, the NHS is still being turned into a cash cow for private companies, because the money that comes in then funnels out into private shareholder hands and fragments the service and all the bad stuff that we were just talking about, right? And I think there's a couple of things, because I have directly asked Labour politicians about this. Some of them won't confront it. They it's almost like they pretend they don't know what you're talking about, which is really weird. You know, I've had conversations with them and they've said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I don't know very much about privatisation," and then they change the subject, which, you know, they're not curious.
I mean, that's concerning if you're an MP. I don't know anything about privatisation.
Yeah. It's like they don't want to go there, and they're just gonna, you know, and so it's quite difficult even to call them out on things because they just sort of act like it's not a problem. Others, like you say, are more brazen about it and will say, I do not think there is a problem here. And it's really odd because, like you say, they completely ignore what the public actually is saying about this, which is that the majority of people don't want it to happen. I think it makes it really difficult, Curtis, because if you've got a group of politicians who will not confront a problem head on, there is no room for a debate about it. You cannot discuss things, and it makes things very polarized. So I've had situations with MPs where they've acted as if I or other campaigners are being antagonistic, when what we actually just want to have is a clear conversation about what's happening. And it can be really maddening because you feel like you're talking to a brick wall. I think if the public could all just talk about the fact how much of the NHS is privatised, how much is everything costing, what services can we practically provide for free, what are the future options, then the temperature in the room would go down and everyone would feel a little bit less angry about it all, honestly.
I mean, I suppose the reason why you might get hostile responses is because that they know their position isn't particularly popular. I mean, that's the way I would see it. You know, they'd be like, well, I don't really want to talk about this because they'd have to admit that, you know, they support privatisation. And it's true, majority of people don't support it. You touched upon it, actually, a little bit. And I think it's really important because we, once again, hear quite a lot about how the state administering services is always bloated and bureaucratic. And, you know, when we talk about markets and private involvement, it's far more efficient. We've heard the same for the internal marketisation of the NHS and privatisation. But in fact, it's anything but. Can you just walk me through how privatisation has actually made things far less efficient, not more efficient?
Yeah, I mean, it's for a couple of reasons, I think, although quantifying this is very difficult, and I haven't seen any robust quantification of this. I actually think some research on this would be really, really interesting. But two things. So firstly, and let's use outsourcing as the example, right? If you've got a bunch of NHS services locally and you have to find out who's going to provide them, and people are tendering contracts, which basically means different groups of company or the public service itself are putting in a bid to run a service, there is obviously a team of people who are having to go through those bids and make decisions and do the paperwork and that process, right? So that in itself is admin, it's cost, it's bureaucracy. And then you've got changeover of services from one provider to another, which frequently happens, obviously, for the same reason. All of that also costs admin and costs and bureaucracy. It's chaotic for staff. It impacts staff development and training and all these sorts of things. It also has a completely unquantified cost, which is the impact it has on patients locally. And I always think about patients with chronic illnesses. So let's say you needed regular contact from a healthcare team near you because you have a chronic condition and the service is changing hands regularly and you're having to explain your very complicated medical history to a healthcare provider again and again and again because it's constantly a new team coming in and taking over your caseload. That all of that costs money. It creates inefficiency, and obviously it's terrible for patients because it's infuriating having to go through all of that, whereas you could have had the same team for years and years, which is what happened, 15, 20 years ago. There was more of that going on. So there's that element of it. There is huge inefficiency created by privatization because of introducing private companies in this sort of revolving door type of mechanism, which is awful. The other thing that I think doesn't get talked about at all is the inefficiency of the total pot of money and the amount that gets taken out by the private companies, like you've been saying, Curtis. And thirdly, something that I don't hear people talking about this at all, but I think it needs spoken about as well. The NHS as a system originally worked because of collaboration, not because of competition, right? And in healthcare, probably like in any other industry, when you develop something, when there's some innovation, when a new idea takes hold, the best thing that idea can do within a public healthcare system is for that to spread, for people to spread the idea between different healthcare hospitals, clinics, whatever it is. The minute you start enabling a private company to own a thing, be it a technology, a new system, or whatever, that private company is not going to be wanting to share that information. It's owned by a private company, right? And so there's a lot of siloing of information and innovation that happens in private companies. Now, I'm not suggesting that the NHS could operate completely on its own without any private involvement. We are always going to have relationships with pharma and with technology in order to bring innovation into the public healthcare system. But as much as we can, we should be keeping the actual patient-facing services run and owned by the public so that we can keep as much learning within the system as we can. What sometimes happens with these private companies is they will come in, they'll swoop in, they'll take something over, they're probably developing and innovating themselves, and then for whatever reason they then extricate themselves because it's not made them enough money. Well, what happens to all of that learning experience? It disappears with the private company when they remove themselves. Whereas in the services which are fully publicly run, you will have staff there who've worked there for decades, they know their patient populations really, really well, and the richness that brings to the experience of patients is something that doesn't get spoken about, but it makes such a difference. If you work in a local NHS department, and you'll find, like I did when I was working as a junior doctor and going around lots of different places getting knowledge, you will constantly be directed to the staff member who's worked in the department for 30 years because they know the place inside out. They're an amazing resource. Everybody knows them. They know everything that's going on. And if you think about it, with a private company that comes in for 2 years and then bounces out again, you're never going to develop that degree of knowledge. And I think that bit of the conversation never gets spoken about in the NHS. We were very, very lucky for a long time that people, staff members, would start a career in the NHS and they would know that they were going to be in the NHS until their retirement. And the amount of knowledge and experience they would deliver for the NHS was unbelievable. And we're losing that now because a lot of people are leaving their jobs because of everything that's going on. You know, it's not a nice place to work for a lot of people anymore.
Yeah, I do want to ask about that. You know, we know that doctors and nurses are leaving. What's the number one thing? Do you think levels of stress, that's the number one factor or one of the biggest factors? What's your assessment on that?
I think it's a combination of things. It's very depressing to see this happening. And it's very depressing, actually, to see the attitude in the media towards healthcare staff at the moment. We're very lucky in the UK that we have really, really good universities, really good training programs for healthcare staff of all different types. And in the past, like I said, people would enter into the NHS and expect to work in the NHS for their whole career. I mean, when I was at medical school, I went to medical school in 2004. There were lots of people there who I don't think would have thought about working private, or if they did work privately, maybe it would be a tiny amount of their practice that they imagined in the future. But it really wasn't something we spoke about a great deal because we all felt pretty solid about our futures in the NHS and we were really enthusiastic about it all. I think if you spoke to a bunch of medical students now and asked them the same question, they would be much more canny about their future opportunities because the debt that students are coming out of university with is absolutely astronomical. A lot of medical students are coming out with £100,000 worth of debt. They are not seeing the same sort of robust future for themselves in terms of their career. It's an enormously stressful place to work because we have, I think it's about 100,000 staff missing in the NHS in England right now. That's chronic now. It's been going on for ages. The training opportunities are not what they were. And there's a horrible attitude towards a lot of NHS staff from lots of people. Now, I completely understand why people are frustrated with the NHS. Millions of people are being profoundly failed right now because of what politicians have done. The thing that's horrible about it is that a lot of that frustration gets transferred onto the staff themselves, and it's not the staff members' fault. So what I hear from lots of doctors and nurses and others online is that people become really devastated. They'll often be doing a job that they previously really enjoyed, they were completely dedicated to, but it takes more and more out of people's, it grinds people down. It means people are taking massive sacrifices personally. And a lot of people at some point hit a wall with that and decide it's too high a price to pay. So they're moving abroad to healthcare systems and being paid 2 or 3 times as much in some cases and being much better supported. Some are changing careers, some are looking to retire early, which is devastating to us as a healthcare system. And frankly, it's a scandal that politicians are allowing this to happen. It shouldn't be like this. We're training lots of excellent staff members, and then they're leaving. It's awful for patients.
Wes Streeting is once again embroiled in a round with the BMA, calling them reprehensible.
When you say, I don't want to be out on strike today, yes, you do, because you have made that choice. So to hold patients to ransom and to be out on strike, setting back the NHS because you don't think we're going fast enough and because the leadership of your union are not honest enough that some of this change takes time, is extremely irresponsible. It is extremely unnecessary. I think people will be shocked by the BMA's reprehensible behaviour. So don't tell me you don't want to be out on strike, because that's exactly where you are. You made that choice, own it.
The union first asked for a 35% pay rise for resident doctors. Before this new strike, they had already walked out 12 times, 11 of those when the Conservatives were in government, causing about 1.5 million outpatient appointments and surgeries to be rescheduled. Their actions have brought results. Pay has gone up 28.9% over the past 3 years, including a 22% increase under Labour. But due to inflation, the union says doctors need another 26% rise to fully restore their pay. This 13th strike will last until 7 a.m. next Wednesday. Now, what complicates this is that polling shows the BMA may in fact be out of touch with its own members. 48% of those polled said the strike should have been called off, and the remaining 19% were unsure, according to the survey by Savanta. And the poll suggests that the last-ditch deal offered by Mr. Streeting would have been accepted by members of the BMA. Now, I don't disagree with the demands from the BMA. I mean, no one should receive a pay cut, especially as a health worker. But given that strikes from doctors do come with risks, surely it's important that BMA members are consulted and asked before a strike goes ahead. Having said that, doctors are facing off against a health secretary who was in bed with private health insurers. 60% of donations Streeting has received have been from health insurance companies, and he's bagged an extra $58,000 since becoming health secretary. What do you make of the BMA's decision to go on strike? They've announced more strikes. There was a poll that showed that, the majority of members were probably not in favour of actually striking, and they were going to take Labour's last deal. So can you give me your perspective on what's going on there?
There's a great deal of unhappiness, as we were saying before. I mean, I don't think there's ever going to be a group of workers who all agree on the same course of action with something like this. My personal feeling about this is that this group of politicians, like the ones before them, have not done a good enough job at listening to frontline staff and really meeting them where they are. And I think a lot of this anger and upset on all sides could have been avoided if staff felt really respected and valued and could see a clear future for themselves and the future of the profession. Because a lot of the upset that I hear from healthcare staff at the moment is not purely about pay. It's about the state of the service. It's about the conditions that they're having to treat patients within. It's about training pathways. There's just not enough jobs for junior doctors at the moment, and there's a lot of people out of work because politicians haven't created jobs for them. And I struggle to sort of marry together this rhetoric from Streeting and others that he's desperate to save the NHS and he's doing everything he can, along with the fact that we have lots of out of work doctors who could be looking after patients were they given a job. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think that is a failure of politicians, because if they have failed to get across whatever their vision is to the people working within the service, then that's terrible, isn't it? They had an opportunity, and I feel like they've missed that opportunity, and that's why things are so bad right now. Strike. It's not just the doctors who, clearly doctors are on strike, but nurses look like they might be taking strike action. I'm sure there'll be other workers as well. There's a huge amount of unhappiness. A lot of that unhappiness is very legitimate. And I think something that I think about a great deal, I'm thinking about it a great deal at the moment, because we're getting into the winter months when things are going to be worse, even worse in the NHS. I know it's been bad in the summer, it's been bad in the autumn. It's going to be worse. This is going to be a very, very bad winter for the NHS by all of, from what all the experts are saying so far. We've every doctor, we've started reaching out and asking staff for testimony, because we have a lot of experience bringing frontline staff testimony into the public domain that we feel needs to be heard. And it's truly devastating to hear what those staff members have to say during, times of high pressure for the NHS. And I honestly think that if the public could hear the things that these staff members tell us and heard those things and then thought to themselves, oh, okay, these staff members are really, really unhappy because of that, I think there would be a much greater understanding between the staff and the public. And that's what we're trying to do. But last winter, for example, we were running a series of briefings for MPs about what's going on, and we were hosting NHS staff members to come along and speak freely. And one of the people who came along, her thoughts always stick in my mind. She's an A&E consultant. And she said something along the lines of working in my A&E department at the moment is like working in a war zone where human rights don't exist. It was absolutely devastating hearing her say it. And it's because hospitals have been neglected, they're overcrowded, they're cramped, staff are looking after patients in undignified circumstances, they feel they can't do their jobs properly when pressures get that high. This isn't just sort of greedy doctors wanting more money. It is people who have chosen to go to medical school because they desperately want to devote their lives to looking after people, and then being put in a corridor and told, look after these patients, and there's a strip light above the patient for sometimes days and days as that patient waits on a trolley, or the staff member is delivering life-saving care in front of other people with no dignity. It's truly terrible. Like, I cannot tell you how awful it is. And so something we're going to do this winter is to try and bring those voices into the public domain, because it needs to change. We can't continue like this, I don't think.
No, I agree. Especially about the point where nurses and doctors want the NHS to improve, not just for themselves, but the quality of care patients get. And that definitely gets lost sort of in the media narrative. I think when it comes to specifically the BMA, right, I mean, people can have their view on whether they think they should go on strike or not in terms of the membership. But if you ask me, I don't think the BMA's demands are ridiculous. I mean, they're asking for full pay restoration. No one should face a pay cut, especially health workers. But I want to get your response to what Streeting said. He called the BMA morally reprehensible. He didn't say, I think this is the wrong decision, but I want to work with them. He said that they were morally reprehensible. And it's not just Streeting. We've heard many people in the corporate media, right-wing politicians, right-wing pundits say that whenever there's a junior doctor strike or a strike for nurses, that the blame of patient safety is exported to these people rather than looking at systemic issues. What do you make of Streeting's comments, but also the sort of wider narrative, or at least someone trying to push the wider narrative of doctors and frontline staff are the ones that are blamed for surgeries being cancelled, for example?
I think, obviously it's enormously disappointing to hear Wes Streeting say those things, but it's not unexpected. I mean, he's made a bit of a name for himself for going to the media and attacking NHS staff members in a way that I think is truly appalling for any health secretary to be doing. I mean, just speaking from my own perspective and how politicians behave, I stopped working clinically in 2020, right? But I qualified in 2010, just as the Tories were coming into power, and I started campaigning during the previous junior doctor strikes back in 2015, 2016. I remember hearing Jeremy Hunt saying things about us, and I was so devastated because as a junior doctor, and I think it's easier maybe for me to say these things than it is for some currently working in the service because it's hard for them to speak up, but you're moving around all over the place. You're doing one job for a little while, then you're moving somewhere else. A lot of people are in rental accommodation that costs a lot of money. You spend a lot of your free time studying for exams in order to progress to the next stage of your training. One of the jobs I did as a junior doctor, not long before all the strikes and everything went on, we did 7 night shifts back to back, 13-hour shifts covering a massive geographical area, and you were having to drive between different hospitals depending on who was having, needed urgent medical treatment. I cannot tell you how intense that work was and how much personal sacrifice I had to make in order to do that job, and how much sort of I don't know what it is. Just, you're constantly thinking, am I doing a good enough job? Am I letting people down? Have I done enough? Have I harmed anybody today? when you're put in a situation under that much pressure. And then to see politicians like Hunt was doing, now like Streeting was doing, speak that way about people who care so much that they turn themselves inside out with worry about their patients, makes me feel really, really angry. But he will be doing it to score political points. He will be doing it because he knows that the public is angry and they're looking for someone to blame, and he certainly doesn't want that to be him or his government. And he's doing it because he's got the floor, right? He has the media's ear at the moment. Lots of media outlets, as you're saying, are owned by billionaires. Lots of them are keen to push this idea that the NHS isn't working and blah, blah, blah. And they have to find a scapegoat. And unfortunately, for patients right now, the scapegoat is the staff members who are providing their care. And what I would like to encourage is for public to recognise that, to recognise what politicians are doing and to come behind the staff in whatever way, whether the staff are talking about jobs or patient safety or pay or whatever it is, and recognise those staff members are there to deliver their care, and that's who they are, really. And I really, really hope this winter that we're able to contribute to that, because it makes me feel really, really angry and devastated. And Curtis, honestly, that is why people are leaving the NHS. Doctors read this stuff and there's such a disconnect between what they see and what they're trying to do at work and the way they're described in the papers. It's awful.
Julia, people watching, of course, know about every doctor, but please, can you just describe what they do and what you do for them, and also where people can find more information about the organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a big group of doctors and other healthcare staff and people who aren't healthcare staff, who are patients or relatives or just people who care about the NHS. And we advocate for NHS patients and staff. We believe that the two groups need to advocate for one another, and that's the only way that we're going to hold politicians to account about what is going on. What about how we set up? So we set up in 2019, initially as a big group of doctors. During the pandemic, we started bringing lots of information from frontline doctors to politicians. We were doing weekly parliamentary briefings because lots of politicians couldn't find out what was happening on the NHS frontline. So we did that. That was very, very intense. Then we took the Tories to court with Good Law Project and proved the existence of the VIP PPE lane. If you've heard of the VIP PPE lane, that was us. And since then, we've been doing lots of research projects about NHS privatisation and doing our best to speak up for the patients and staff. And we're going to continue doing so. And if you would like to be involved in what we do, we would love that. All of our stuff can be found at www.everydoctor.org.uk. And we're doing two big things at the moment. We are investigating what looks like these new PFI deals and what that's going to mean for the NHS. And we're, like I said, we're gathering testimony, and we're going to start speaking to the media about what's going on. So watch this space, and we would love to have you involved.
Thank you to our viewers who tuned in. Of course, thank you to Dr. Patterson for joining me tonight. Remember to like this stream, and if you're not a subscriber, then please hit that button. If you want us to grow, then you can head over to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. There is a link to our Patreon where you can support us monthly, or follow the other link to give us a one-time contribution. Alternatively, you can become a YouTube member for just 99p. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you come back and watch us on Wednesday, and I'll see you next time.